house, and if any Indian tries to stop me, I'll blast him.
You know, the only thing more pathetic than Indians on TV is Indians watching Indians on TV.
Hello, everybody. This is Ian, back again with another episode of Native Film Talk. Today, Wind River. So this movie I saw last night, and it's my second time seeing the movie. The first time I saw it was in theaters, and solid movie, just directed by Taylor Sheridan. It's a great film. Just standalone Native representation aside, it's a thriller, murder mystery film, and Taylor Sheridan, the director, wrote this film also, and he also wrote Sicario and Hell or High Water. Within Hell or High Water, Sicario, and Wind River, he actually wanted this to be a trilogy of sorts, really a reimagining of the Western kind of frontier, like the frontier, I don't know what you call it exactly, but reimagining the West is kind of how he envisioned this. So down south, you have Sicario. How are things looking with the border and in the southern part of the United States? And then you go further north to the plains. What are the modern day farmers doing in Hell or High Water? They're robbing banks, being overtaken by oil barons still. And what does that look like? Those farmers having to resort to robbing banks to get by and prevent their house and land to be taken from them by the banks. And now you have Wind River. Wind River, because the frontier always has natives, so now you want to know what's the state of affairs with natives. And so fast forward 2017, Wind River. This takes place on the Wind River Reservation, hence the title. And this is the Arapaho Nation's reservation. And we learn in the film this reservation is roughly the size of Rhode Island. So it's pretty big territory. They have only 6 police officers, tribal police officers, covering this entire jurisdiction. It's a very barren land. It looks like most reservations. You know, it's not ripe with resources. Typically, if it's ripe with resources, it's below the ground, which is why there are oil rigs. There's oil rigs near the reservation, and that oil rig is the really where a lot of the climax of the movie takes place, is on the oil rig, and we'll get to that in a second. But this is actually my third attempt actually. I'm trying to get this right. I'm still trying to figure out where I want this podcast to go. So I recorded this episode earlier, actually last night right after I saw the movie, and I ended up going over the entire plot and almost breaking it down scene by scene in a way. And by the time I finished my podcast, it was 50 minutes. And I'm like, man, I didn't even touch on what I wanted to bring up, like draw on my own experience, my own perception, dissect whether or not the actors were accurate. There was accurate portrayal of Native Americans, and I kind of really turned it into a film review, like a review of just Wind River. And it's not really what I want to do. There's plenty of other podcasts that do that better than me. I bet you could look on Apple Podcasts, go on to iTunes right now, look up Wind River. You could probably find some great podcasts that will just review just this movie and probably do a much better job of it than I ever could. But my perspective is I'm Native. I'm born and raised on the Navajo res, and that's a perspective that I feel, my indigenous upbringing, I feel that is a perspective that I can offer to the listeners. So I went and scrapped that podcast, and I was like, you know what? Good attempt, Ian, but let's give this another shot. So how I plan to do this, it goes without saying, spoiler alert. I'm just going to do a quick recap of the plot. I'm going to try to just go high level as quick as possible. Really, I'm assuming that you've seen this movie. So I'm assuming that you've seen this movie. I'm going to talk about the authenticity of the cast, go over each character, including Jeremy Renner. Was it an accurate casting? How was their representation of natives? And then cliff notes of the film. So first, let's go to the cast before we jump into the plot, because that's an important part of it. So the cast, two top billed actors, Jeremy Renner, Elizabeth Olsen. Hawkeye and Scarlet Witch. That's all I kept singing initially because of all the Marvel movies. But you have the two top billed actors in the film. You have Jeremy Renner, who is Corey Lambert. And then you have the FBI agent, Elizabeth Olsen, and Jane Banner. And then we get to the meat of the cast. So you have the natives. There's multiple natives cast in this film. And I'm just going to talk about them real quick. So Kelsey Aspel. So Natalie Hansen is the focus of the film as it starts off. She is the missing, murdered Indigenous woman in the film. And we find her in the snow. And that's kind of how the movie kicks off as Jeremy Renner's character finds her. And so Kelsey Aspel, Kelsey Chow, whichever one she goes by now. And then Tattoo Cardinal, she makes an appearance. Graham Greene, Julia Jones from Blackheart. From Black Cloud. I recognized her. I was like, where do I know her from? So Julia Jones, she was the female lead in Black Cloud. You have Takola Black Elk, Martin Sensmeyer. So overall, just a great native cast. Gil Birmingham. I forgot Gil Birmingham. He's the dad of the missing murdered Indigenous woman in the film. And it is powerful. I mean, this film really gets nitty gritty and shows the reality of what it's like when that happens on the reservation in these communities and the hopelessness that you feel when this occurs because of issues surrounding jurisdiction, laws, sovereignty, tribal sovereignty, where that lies, and just resources. I mean, they talk about how resource constrained they are. 6 police officers covering the entire really region the size of Rhode Island. So these cops are really set up for failure from the start. And so when you have cases like this, it's kind of this bleak outlook because you're like, damn it, another one. And there's not a very optimistic tone to this film. So the castings, let me just run through the plot real quick. And then we'll talk about, were they accurate or not. So the plot starts off, Jeremy Renner, he's a tracker. He's a hunter. He works for the Game and Fish Department. And he's kind of like animal control in a way. You kind of get the feeling that he is some kind of, he gets called in to hunt predators, essentially. And Game and Fish people actually do that. They go in and regulate populations of predators and predators and game to make sure the balance of the ecosystem is being maintained. Whether it's the elk population, the deer population, bears, mountain lions, coyotes, whatever. Because if the predators obviously they run the gamut, they overhunt, they kill too many things, they get too comfortable near humans, they could potentially start killing people. So this is basically what happens. A mountain lion comes in, he gets called in, and he's like, all right, I'm going to go find this mountain lion. And in his pursuit of the mountain lion, following the tracks, he finds the body of Natalie, the individual who passed away in the snow. And it's kind of an odd situation because she's 5 miles from the nearest oil rig, they say. It's like, well, and she's 3.5 miles from the nearest house. How the heck did she end up out here? She has all of her clothes on except has no shoes, no socks. And like, what the heck happened? So there's seemingly no way that she could have been dumped off there. There's no way that, they don't see any snowmobile tracks or anything. They're like, it doesn't make sense how this person ended up out here. So FBI comes in, as we later learn from the coroner's office. If it's ruled a homicide on the reservation, it's now federal jurisdiction. So an FBI agent, Elizabeth Olsen, comes on to the scene, really kind of a fish out of water. They kind of really explore that throughout the movie, how she's just kind of out of place and she's the outsider white person. And Jeremy Renner is the in, kind of the community white person who they accept and have brought in as one of their own because of his connections to the community through his work, but also the fact that he has 2 children that are in that community, one of which we learn later is that also passed away, also was killed in the same manner that Natalie was. So Elizabeth Olsen arrives, and fast forward basically, Elizabeth Olsen, Graham Greene, Jeremy Renner. They all start working together to try to figure out what's going on. They end up going to Natalie's brother's place. They try to track him down. It's like, hey, maybe he knows. And this is the character that Martin Sensmeyer plays, and also Takola Black Elk. So Sam Littlefeather is his character's name. They kind of go to his trailer, and he's basically living in what seems like a meth house, what seems like a meth trailer. It's a couple of double wides, put together, and it's just all burned out on the inside, bunch of graffiti, and they eventually have a shootout, and they take Martin Sensmeyer's character and ask him questions. And he eventually says, like, hey, was it that white guy? After they tell him that his sister passed, was it that guy she was with, that white guy that works at the oil rig? He's a security guard over there. So afterwards, they go and check it out. They're like, okay, well, it seems like there's a lot of things we need to explore. And one of which is the oil rig. So eventually they go to the oil rig, and a shootout ensues because we get a flashback as they get to the oil rig. We find out that Shane from The Walking Dead, turns out, is the person who Natalie was seeing. And she shows up at the trailers. They start, messing around, and, they clearly have been seeing each other for a while. And then the rest of the security officers at the oil rig show up and gets physical. They start screwing around with Natalie, and Matt, Shane from The Walking Dead's character, didn't like it. He got physical with everybody. And then all of a sudden it just turns into a brawl. And Natalie gets knocked unconscious and eventually is sexually assaulted. And she comes to fighting back. And then Matt, Shane from The Walking Dead, goes and starts fighting everybody. He's just like, get off her. And then pretty soon the swarm of the guys all direct their attention to him. He's basically done. He knows, like, this is my end. So he kind of gestures to Natalie, like, just get the hell out of here. And so she, at this point has all her clothes on but no shoes, and she just books it out of the trailer. And that's how you assume she just runs from there, the 5 miles that it took to eventually end up where they found her at the beginning of the film. So that was the flashback. And then law enforcement is at the drill rig site. Security guards are also there. Security guards at oil rigs, they kind of inspect the lines, the oil lines. They're basically taking snowmobiles up and down these things to make sure that predators aren't coming along to screw with the oil rigs. But also there's a lot of money around this to make sure that there's no individuals trying to sabotage any part of the rig. So they are armed, and really armed. Like, they have automatic weapons, semi-automatic rifles. They have an automatic rifle, which I don't know how they got that in the movie, but they have, handguns, and they open carry. And then eventually, they have a big shootout. And throughout this whole time, Jeremy Renner's kind of off in the distance. He was doing his own thing, trying to track the mountain lions, trying to find the snowmobile tracks. And then eventually he's like, hey, there's an alternate path to get over to this drill rig. And so he kind of just goes and checks things out and sees things are getting out of hand. And right when Elizabeth Olsen is about to meet her doom, Jeremy Renner just comes in. He starts just mowing down people with his large hunting rifle, large caliber. Just takes everybody out. And then eventually, the only person left is really seemingly just Jeremy Renner, Elizabeth Olsen, and the man who was responsible for sexually assaulting Natalie at the beginning of the film. Sexually assaulting Natalie. So Jeremy Renner takes him up to the top of Gannett Peak, that we learn is the highest mountain in Wyoming, and gives him the same chance that he gave Natalie. He was like, all right, you're free to go after you confess. If you confessed everything you did, I'll let you live. And he's a man of his word. He confessed everything, saying exactly what he did. And Jeremy Renner wanted to give that closure to the Hansen family because Gil Birmingham is the father of Natalie. And they have a scene earlier in the movie where they meet and they talk and they see the mother, how devastated she is, and, rightfully so. And then the father, he's just a mess. And they bond because later you find out that the daughters of Gil Birmingham and Jeremy Renner were friends. There's a picture that they show later on, and they clearly have ties to each other, and they clearly know each other. So Jeremy Renner wanted to give closure to this family, to let them know, like, hey, one, these guys are going to get away with it, but two, I'm gonna make them pay. And so the individual who sexually assaulted her, he took him up to Gannett Peak. I don't know how he got up there with a snowmobile, but that's beside the point. And just said, like, you go run until, you die. You give her the same chance you got. He's like, a highway is X amount of miles that way. If you make it to that highway, you're a free man. And of course, he's not going to make it. But the comparison they try to make, Natalie ran 5 miles before her lungs burst, before the lung sacs. The sacs inside of her lungs, basically crystallized and froze, and then her lungs burst and drowned in her blood. That was what the medical examiner says happens. And also what Jeremy Renner says happens. And the individual at the end, he lasts 500 yards maybe, and then passes away. He dies up there. So then the movie ends with Jeremy Renner going back to the Hanson family, talks to Gil Birmingham and told him, hey, it's done, and you kind of see things end there. And Gil Birmingham has paint on his face, and he says it's his death face. He's trying to figure out what's going on, what's going to be next, And then it's you kind of get the impression that he was going to commit suicide, or he was going to do something. Like he's at the end. But what happened was their son Chip, who was found earlier, Martin Sensmeyer, in the meth house at the police station, decided to reach out to his family, call his parents. So he's like, I haven't seen my son in over a year. I haven't talked to him in a long time. He's like, there's hope, at least with the right there. He's reached out. And so the last image of the movie, let me go ahead and find this. The Wind River closing statement. While missing person statistics are compiled for every other demographic, none exist for Native American women. Then the next part is, no one knows how many are missing. And then fade to black. Movie ends there. So, in a quick order, that was the summary, really, of Wind River. Accurate casting, was it? Okay, so let's go to the cast after. Was this a white savior movie? I was on the fence. Initially, I'm like, I get it. So in my experience, I know a guy, a family friend through my in-laws, that he's a trapper for a living on the res. This guy lives out of a travel trailer, basically, and he just travels all over the res, and he traps, he hunts, and he is a better trapper hunter than I would ever be. Ever. He knows everything because that's his job full time. I didn't even know that was still an occupation in 2020. But he makes a living doing that. So it made sense to me that a character like Jeremy Renner would exist. And he's a trapper, and he's pretty cool. I mean, he's cool enough that, that he's a family friend. He's white. Doesn't have any native connections. He just kind of asked around and eventually was friendly enough to kind of just strike up relationships with people to allow them to, for him to be available, be around, and be like, hey, I'm going to be wandering around near your property, just letting you know I'm a trapper, I do this and that, I'm going to be setting traps, and yeah. So it fit my kind of experience. So I'm like, I guess Jeremy Renner is not that bad of a casting. And also, I said earlier, that's Hawkeye. I mean, Hawkeye is a badass character who uses a bow and arrow, coincidentally, and he fits the bill as like, yeah, he's a cool dude. Like he's just a man's man at this point. So the fact that he's in this role, I get it. I'm like, it's not really a white savior. The plot makes sense, but at the same time, I bounced the idea off my wife, and she pretty much just squashed it. So thank you to my wife. She was like, yeah, of course it's a white savior. Remove Jeremy Renner from this movie, what happens? Well, he never goes to Gil Birmingham's house and says, I'm going to find her. We're going to get this taken care of. Throughout the entire film, Elizabeth Olsen leans on Jeremy Renner's knowledge to fix the problem. Graham Greene throughout the entire movie is like, oh, thank God he's going to be here, you know? Like, he kind of has this sigh of relief that, like, oh, Jeremy Renner's going to be helping. Thank goodness. Without him, there's no way. It would have just been another invisible statistic had it not been for him. So it very much is a white savior movie in that way, but it's not in your face. Like, I'm more Indian than you, like in some instances, like Dances with Wolves in the past. And unfortunately, the truth of the matter is you gotta sell tickets. You gotta put butts in the seats. And I think this is a controversial piece of Hollywood, but having Elizabeth Olsen and Jeremy Renner as your lead 1 and 2 is going to sell a lot more tickets than if your number 1 and 2 were Adam Beach and Irene Bedard. I hate that it's like that, but that's just the way it is. This movie grossed about $48 million worldwide, and while Taylor Sheridan does have a reputation of being a solid writer, this was his directorial debut. Like, this was the first one that he's going to put his mark on the industry, and he is going to say, like, all right, moving forward, this is a taste of what I can bring. And so he was going to make sure that it succeeds by casting Jeremy Renner, Elizabeth Olsen. He did a great job of bringing in other prominent native actors. You look at the rest of the cast, it's a who's who of the indigenous, you know, actors that are out there that people that know about. Really, all that was missing was Arnold Joseph showing up and Adam Beach showing up. There's only a handful of like other prominent actors that you missed, but you really hit the big ones. You really hit on the big ones. I think this film did a good job with what it could have done, or what it was given. I feel like the native experience that they showed was accurate. I think it was. I think it was pretty accurate. But when it comes to MMIW, it was helpful that this shed light on that issue. Missing murdered indigenous women is a big problem on the reservation and all reservations. They're finally getting statistics together to try to get a level of understanding of where this actually is. Like, how big of an issue is this? And it's pretty massive. Problem is, going back to the white savior thing, this is honestly the ideal outcome, what you would imagine of MMIW, what I would anticipate the ideal is. One, your child is taken from you. That's tragic. I can't even imagine what kind of pain you would want to be in, and the dark, deep, dark places your mind would go, just thinking like, man, if I could just get my hands on the person that did this or the people responsible. And in this case, they can do that through Jeremy Renner's character. But you do make the assumption based on that plot that had he not been there, had he not had that connection with his daughter who passed and the daughter in the movie, Natalie, had they not been connected, I don't know if his interests would have been aligned enough to try to intervene, to come together with law enforcement and the FBI and try to assist. So there might have not been resolution. And that kind of doesn't sit well with me because, I mean, this is the modern cowboy. Jeremy Renner is the modern cowboy. The rules don't apply to him. They're just guidelines. He just lives his life, by living in a cabin. He doesn't have, he's a man of modest needs. He doesn't need a lot. And so he just kind of really is the modern cowboy. Like, the rules don't apply to him. He can go and murder someone, not a big deal. He can go get away with murder, not a big deal. I think a true vigilante movie would have been great to see the natives try and find themselves, govern themselves a little bit. When in this case, Graham Greene's character, while humorous, like Graham Greene, man, he is so funny. I love everything Graham Greene is in. Thunderheart, he's hilarious. But Graham Greene's character in this is just kind of like, yeah, that's how it goes. Every remark he makes to another native in the movie is all negative. It's like, hey, how's your dad doing? I don't know. You put him in prison. Oh yeah, I did do that. And he makes that remark like 2 or 3 times with different natives. It's just like, all we are is criminals drug addicts in the movie. And Graham Greene is, really just like comic relief. Like, he doesn't add any depth. He has to rely on a non-native guy to trap and hunt for them. And, and that's where I'm not sure. Are you leaning into stereotypes by assuming native people can hunt, can trap, have a good understanding of the lay of the land? But at the same time, is it so far-fetched that a white guy who isn't a part of the nation, but somehow just grew up and spent a lot of time, enough time in that area, due to his job, he's more proficient at it than the local community? I don't know. But I feel like Graham Greene's character could have been better. He could have been more involved. He should have been, I think, more of a hero, in my opinion. And instead, he gets killed off in the shootout. Seemingly, you can assume that he gets killed off. And as far as the other characters that were represented, there was a few scenes that I wasn't too sure about, like the mother of Natalie. I'm not sure what they were going for, so if anybody has any ideas, please tell me. This is the cutting scene. So Gil Birmingham enters the door right after, so the FBI agent and Jeremy Renner come in, and they're just asking them, like, what's going on? She's like, where's your wife? And Elizabeth Olsen's just trying to get a feel for, what the parents know and why this 18-year-old indigenous woman was in a position where she would be killed. And he's like, it's kind of a curt exchange between the two. And then eventually he's like, well, where's your wife? And so she walks off into the other room, and Jeremy Renner's like, hey, no. Like, he seemingly already knows what's going on. He seemingly already has an inclination that she's in the room harming herself. And he's like, don't go in there. I promise you're not going to like what you see. And Elizabeth Olsen goes in anyway. She opens the door, and the mom is in there cutting herself. I didn't freeze frame. It's kind of a gruesome scene. I wanted to pause it and watch it. I was watching it with my wife. I wasn't about to do that, but I wasn't sure what they were going for. Is that just self-harm for the sake of, I just want to feel something other than the pain that I'm feeling, than the sadness I'm feeling, than the gut-wrenching feeling that I have right now because my daughter was ripped from me and I can't get resolution. There's no way, it's futile for me to even try to do anything else. And Elizabeth Olsen just closes the door. She is an FBI agent, but she didn't intervene. She didn't say anything. She just closes the door, doesn't make her presence known, and just continues to let her do it. And I don't know what, and maybe this is a non-native perspective thing, but immediately I wondered, I'm like, is that an Arapaho thing? Like, is there, as a Navajo, I'm wondering, like, is there a grieving process like that? Or is that, like, what is that? What was the purpose of that scene? I don't know. Normally it's, grieve, you cut your hair. I was expecting that. I was not expecting a cutting scene. And I thought that was just weird. And I don't know if that's going to perpetuate any stereotypes of people, like, asking natives, like, oh, do you cut yourselves after, a death in the family? Because everybody in the house was okay with it, except Elizabeth Olsen. Everybody was accepting it. It's like, okay, everyone's good with it. Like, she can go cut herself, not a problem. And I just thought that was odd. But outside of that, Gil Birmingham, it's good native actor. He's in Hell or High Water. He's in another Taylor Sheridan film. I believe he's in Yellowstone as well, which is also a Taylor Sheridan piece of work. So, yeah, Gil Birmingham, great character. There is a scene at the end that kind of adds to the story, the lens that I didn't really like in this movie, is that, native life is futile. One, we're missing, we're being killed off, we're invisible statistics, and on top of that, we're losing our language, we're losing our culture, and there is no end in sight. It's only going to get worse. We're only going to be more disconnected from our culture, more removed from our culture. And even though we live on the land, we're not connected to it in any way. We don't know how to hunt. We don't know how to trap. We need help. And the scene at the very last scene of the movie, Gil Birmingham has the face paint on. He has the paint on his face, and he's saying that it's his death face. And Jeremy Renner's like, how would you know what your death face looks like? And he says, I don't know. I don't have anyone to teach me. And that's kind of just a callback to how the language loss and culture loss is just rampant across the nation. And then he says something that I don't really like, honestly. And he's just, he talks about, hey, Chip called me. Something silver lining. Chip finally called me. I'm going to go pick him up. But first, I got to wipe this shit off my face. And talking about the face paint. To me, I just personally, this is just Ian talking. I didn't like that. Something that he is looking at in reverence, to take solace in, to mourn his daughter's death. It's a part of his culture. I don't know what his cultural background is, and I think that's a thing that I didn't like really about Gil Birmingham, the Hanson family in the movie. They didn't really layer any of these. They didn't give any depth to the native characters. The only people that had depth were the two white characters. I don't have motives for Gil Birmingham. I don't have a background on Chip. I feel like learning more about Chip, Martin Sensmeyer's character, Gil Birmingham's character, would have really helped develop the story from a native lens. Because I don't know, has Gil Birmingham tried to connect to his culture multiple times and just has no outlets? Is there no other elders there? Are they really all dead? What does a death face mean? I feel like Taylor Sheridan has spent time with native people. At some point in his life, he did. He's supposedly a cowboy, and I don't know exactly what that means when they say that. I've heard other actors call him that and refer to him as that. I'm not sure if that means he was, raised cattle, did rodeo, what that looks like. But all the actors that he's worked with, they refer to him as like, he's a real cowboy. But he has spent time near Pine Ridge Indian Reservation. According to him, he spent time on the Pine Ridge Res, kind of grew up around natives. So he has these insider jokes that I feel like don't have context. There's a story, an article about him, and the headline is, the big joke on the reservation is a white person saying, my grandma was a Cherokee princess. My great-great-grandma was a Cherokee princess. And this article, I think it was like Variety or something. It was a really prominent news source. They blew this up like, oh my gosh, look at this insight. Look at this insight that Taylor Sheridan has. Can you believe how woke he is? He is so in tune with the native people. This is accurate representation. And he has a few really insider things that really don't have context. Tukola Black Elk. He's the role of Sam Littlefeather in the movie. He's one of the drug addicts that ends up getting shot in a shootout with Elizabeth Olsen. On the red carpet, I watched an interview with him where he was walking by. He gets interviewed and basically like, hey, what did you think of the movie? What did you think of Taylor Sheridan? And he's like, Taylor Sheridan's legit, man. He's like, he's no joke. Like, he's awesome. He talks about like how detailed of a filmmaker he is. He talks about one scene where he uses imagery of a spider, the trickster. And so in like the Arapaho, apparently in the like Arapaho, kind of just the natives in that region, view the spider as a trickster, a symbol for a trickster. And the only reason that made sense to me was I saw Skins. In Skins, they talk about Iktomi and him being indicator that something's going to happen. He's a trickster. In my culture, it's coyotes. So they had both of those in this movie. But there's only one scene where there's a spider in the entire movie, and it's right before Jeremy Renner discovers that there's an alternate path to get down to the oil rigs where the security guards and the law enforcement have their big shootout at the end of the movie. And so he kind of has I guess that's supposed to be oh gosh, like something's happening. It was a throwaway scene. He's just like, it's a scene of just a snow, like classic scene of somebody pointing at where the person's going to step. So the camera is pointing at the ground of where Jeremy Renner's going to put his foot in the ground in the snow. And then as he puts his foot in the snow, a spider kind of runs near his leg. And that's it. And I feel like that's a really insider thing. And, clearly he really knows his stuff in some regard, but doesn't know enough to add context. Because in Skins, they elaborate. Like, I feel like in Skins, they know, like, hey, the trickster isn't a trickster for everybody. Like, not all tribes have tricksters. Not all tribes have spiders as their symbol for tricksters. It's different across the nations. Like, Chris Iyer goes into depth and explains it, makes it painfully obvious. And so I'm sure some of the people that are from that nation, from that area, that understand, like, yeah, no brainer, that's a trickster. But for me as a Navajo, I'm like, man, that's insightful. That's awesome. And in this one, he just like peppers it in there as like, oh, look at what I know. And I didn't like that. Had Tukola never mentioned that in an interview, I never would have noticed, and I never would have unpacked it, and I never would have realized it. But yeah, that's kind of where things are. Looking at my notes here, I think overall it was an accurate depiction of the natives with the story that was written. I think overall it was all doom and gloom. I think this is my problem with the movie. As a movie itself, a standalone film, great film, entertaining. Even though I kind of went over the plot, encourage you to watch it again. Encourage you to try to figure out the symbolism and if there's other scenes that I missed. But this is doom and gloom. This is natives are in jail. They're on track to be in jail. They're drug addicts. They're disconnected from the culture. They're losing their language. They're on desolate lands. They are in a perpetual state that's going to continue this cycle. And on top of that, there's missing, murdered, indigenous women. And there's no end in sight, by the way, because they're invisible statistics. So, I didn't like that part. Because as a native, you know, as a person who is college educated, who left the reservation and still goes back and still views it as my home, I didn't just leave it in the rear view and never went back. And that's kind of the perception they gave of like, you just got to get the hell out of here. Because there's a scene with Julia Jones when she's like, hey, if I land that big job in Jackson Hole, I'm out. I'm getting out of here. And made it seem like that's the only way out and I'm never coming back. And I kind of didn't really like that because that's not necessarily true. That's not an accurate piece. I mean, it is for some people. If you're fleeing from something that's painful, if you're leaving because it's associated with something traumatic, I get it. But that's still your homeland. That's still home. And for me personally, Ian talking, I'm not going to leave it in the headlight, leave it in the rearview mirror and never turn back. So I didn't like that part. There was no positive message with Native people. It is an accurate depiction of where we are in some regard, but I think it's problematic because, once again, we're talking about Native representation in film. Wind River grossed $48 million in the box office. This is touted as an accurate Native film, but because there were natives in there, actual natives. But this story, if this is your only interaction with natives is through this movie, that's going to frame your perceptions of what you think natives are and what we're capable of. And some people might say, Ian, you're being dramatic. There's no way. Like you're kind of just you're being too sensitive about things. There's no way people are going to think that. I'll give you an example of why that's true. I have a coworker who's Albanian, and I love movies, obviously. So I saw Taken, Liam Neeson film, great abduction film, oddly similar to this, where it's like a chase movie. You're trying to figure out who done it. And so that is the only context I have for Albanian people. And my coworker, I asked him, like, so have you seen Taken? And he hates that question because everybody assumes that because he's Albanian, that he's a drug dealer or he's a sex trafficker and he's like up to no good and he's just has a skewed worldview on things. But I'm positive that unless you know Albanian people already, Taken is probably going to frame your perception of what Albanian people are because they vilified them. They showed them. They typecast them as like, hey, this is who Albanian people are in America, in the world. This is what they do. And it's such a niche population that who am I to say, like, what else is out there? I'm not going to go, let me go find other things that show Albanians in a positive light. I just take it as face value of like, man, that was a crazy movie. Albanians are nuts. Same with this movie. Natives got problems with drugs. And that's true. We do. Higher than, most populations. But that's not all we are. So, the last thing I will say about MMIW, this film did do a good job in that it shed light on this. Like what a community goes through. You had to make it in an entertaining way, otherwise people aren't going to watch it. And this guy is like a big production guy. He's not like a indie filmmaker who's just like making the movie he wants to see. He's trying to make some money. He wants to further his career. But what I didn't like, the MMIW, there's no call to action. You put that up there in the last scene of the movie. That like, hey, there's no stats that exist for Native women, but they exist for every other demographic in the world. And to this day, nobody knows how many people are missing. And that's it. You just kind of leave this like hopeless tale out there of like, well, it's nothing's going to be done. When there are grassroots movements ongoing right now, there are individuals trying to bring awareness to MMIW. And I think what would have been powerful to me, this is Ian, if Ian was allowed to just add a scene to the movie and then walk away, I would have loved to see maybe after that fade to black. You fade in a picture of a Native woman with the red hand over her face and just kind of explain like, hey, the reason why this happens is because it's supposed to symbolize the voices that are silenced, or it's supposed to highlight that this is an invisible statistic specific to Indigenous women, and give a little bit of optimism of like, hey, there's hope. Here's how you can help. Here's how you can bring awareness. Here's where you can go next to learn more about MMIW, to learn about what is happening at the Native grassroots level, at the reservation level, within those communities that are trying to find ways to solve these murders, to find these women, to ensure that this is not a recurring thing for, time immemorial, that this is just how it is in the Native landscape. So, that's my review of the film. What'd you think? Overall, Wind River is better than most. Despite everything I said, it is highly entertaining. And Taylor Sheridan did intend for this to be a trilogy. So if you haven't seen Sicario, you haven't seen Hell or High Water, and you haven't seen Wind River, highly recommend you watch these 3 films. So, there's one dangling piece. I will close with the movie. Kelsey Chow. MMIW. The most important thing, I think, takeaway of this film is that, hey, missing murdered Indigenous women, this is a thing, and this is going to continue to happen. Did you know? That's the kind of the shocking reveal. Kelsey Chow. She plays Natalie in the film. Not a Native person. Seemingly. So she now goes by Kelsey Aspille. Asbille. Aspille. I believe it's Aspille. Prior to 2017, her name was Kelsey Chow. And then when Wind River came out, she became Kelsey Aspille, and all of a sudden started claiming heritage to the Eastern Band of the Cherokee Nation. The Eastern Band of the Cherokee Nation went on to say later, we have no record of her heritage. We have no indication that her lineage has any connections to our nation. However, even now, she still works with Taylor Sheridan. I believe she's still getting cast in Native roles moving forward. So that's a interesting one, like, did she pull the wool over the eyes of the producers? Is it the producer's responsibility to validate that you are Native, or are they just going to take it at face value? She is Asian. Her Chinese heritage, Chinese American heritage is what it seems like. And there are similar facial features. And when I first saw this movie, I thought, oh yeah, she passes off as a Native. And then now that I see this again, I'm like, what was I seeing? She's not Native. And, before anyone goes and says, well, Ian, what's a Native supposed to look like? I wish I could explain it, but you just know. You just have a feeling. And, and that's being a Native person that's raised on the reservation, you just kind of have a pretty good idea. I don't want to get too much trouble by continuing this one, but yeah, I mean, so when you look at her now, you kind of realize like, yeah, she's a pretty mid-20s actor that really kind of fits the mold of what they were looking for and is going to help drive the point home, and really going to be a tearjerker, and it's really going to pull at your heartstrings as you watch this movie. But you couldn't have got a Native person? You couldn't have gotten someone from the Wind River Reservation, from the Wind River, Arapaho, nation. You couldn't have got someone from that? You have accurate casting across your entire bill. Jeremy Renner and Elizabeth Olsen removed. But you couldn't have there's got to be an up-and-coming rising star in the indigenous, acting community. There's got to be someone. Instead, you choose Kelsey Aspel. I don't know. I thought that definitely missed the mark. If you're trying to drive the point home on missing murdered Indigenous women, you cast a non-Native person in that role. It's to the point now where she's still getting work in Hollywood, still as a Native person in Yellowstone right now, still getting cast as a Native person. And there's been backlash. Even now, Taylor Sheridan is getting backlash from that because Eastern Band of Cherokee Nation doesn't recognize her, doesn't say there's any evidence that she is of that nation. And so this really is it kind of comes full circle when Taylor Sheridan's like, hey, the big running joke on the reservation is my great-great-grandma is a Cherokee princess. That is essentially what she is doing. She is saying like, hey, I'm Chinese and I'm American, but, I got a little bit of Cherokee somewhere in my history, so cast me as a Native person. And she does acknowledge, I never grew up on a reservation. I'm not connected to my culture, but that's who I am. And now she moves forward as Kelsey Aspel and not Kelsey Chow anymore. And I think there's a lot wrong with that. And Adam Beach, Wes Studi, they've gone out to, go against what they've done in Yellowstone and just say like, hey, we can't do better than that. There's plenty of other people out there. And the main problem with casting non-Native people in Native roles is we can only do that. It's very rare that you're Wes Studi, that you're Adam Beach, that you are cast into a non-Native role. Wes Studi was Sphinx in Mystery Men. He was in Avatar. He was Sagat in Street Fighter. He transcended being just Native. He went outside of that. It's rare you do that because most of the time they're just like, oh, you're Native, you can do this. So there's very few of those roles available. So give those opportunities to Native people to fill those roles, to tell that experience. And we don't give that. And it's problematic at times, especially when you miss the mark like this and you're trying to pass her off as Native. So overall, this was a solid film, just from a movie standalone. It definitely, from a representation standpoint, it's better on the spectrum. It's better representation. It's more accurate. It's a little limited in the view of the worldview, but solid. All right, everybody. Talk to you later.